Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya Avir Avir Maeti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. O Lord, guide us through and through, and ever protect us with thy loving presence. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings everywhere. So I hope you're enjoying Thanksgiving with football and American football and World Cup football. I hope you're really enjoying it this time. And thank you everybody for coming today. Today we have a special gift, Swami Medhananda, who's now resides at Vedanta Society of our Hollywood Center. He has been in India for many, many years, and he is what we call our academic Swami. He has been trained in English literature and academic studies, and with his training, before coming, he studied at Berkeley and in Oxford, and he now has rewriting sort of like the philosophy of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. He's got 2 books out. One was on the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna, the other is on the philosophy of Swami Vivekananda. And he is giving new insights and new ways of thinking of what is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. And if you are with us now, he's conducting a class through our San Diego Center called Vedanta Life Academy, where he's talking about Swami Vivekananda's philosophy and new insights and new ways of what does it mean by all religions lead to the same ultimate goal. What does it mean that all yogas are different paths? He's just giving us new insights. So brilliant new ways and modern ways of thinking. So with this, I'd like to welcome Swami Medhananda to talk about Vedanta for Dummies.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. And my pranams to Swami Harinamahananda. You guys are true Vedantins. How do I know that? Because you're foregoing an exciting World Cup match right now, which starts at 11, Argentina, Mexico, to listen to Vedanta. So thank you. So yeah, the title is Vedanta for Dummies, and I'm not calling you dummies. We're all dummies. Until we realize God, we're all dummies. So I thought, the idea behind this talk is all of our centers, or most of our centers outside of India, are called Vedanta societies. And many of you have been coming to Vedanta societies for many years, I'm sure. When a friend asks you, where'd you go today, this morning? And you say, I went to a Vedanta society. A natural question is, what is Vedanta? How would you respond to that question? This is what I want to explore. And the first thing I want to emphasize is that there's no one right answer to that question. And that's part of the point of this talk, is that there are many different ways of explaining Vedanta, understanding Vedanta, practicing Vedanta, living Vedanta. And until we have a broad understanding of the kind of topography, until we really understand how the different range of possibilities there are of Vedantic traditions, I think we're depriving ourselves of the riches of the Vedantic tradition. That's my opinion. And one tendency I find among many people, even associated with our tradition, either monastic or lay, is that they make a serious mistake. They tend to equate Vedanta with one school of Vedanta. Namely, can you guess? Can anyone guess? Advaita Vedanta. Vedanta equals Advaita Vedanta. In particular, Shankara school. And I think that's really impoverishing the Vedantic tradition. You can say you can follow Advaita Vedanta, there's no problem. But don't say that Advaita Vedanta represents all of Vedanta. That's part of what I'm encouraging you to think about today. There are many schools of Vedanta, including Vishishtadvaita Vedanta of Ramanuja, Dvaita Vedanta of Madhva, Achinta Veda Vedanta of Chaitanya, and many others. I'll go into that in some detail. Swami Tapasanandaji, who was the vice president of our order, is one of the few monks in our order who was able to think outside the box a bit. And he wrote a book, a very important book, which is not widely read, unfortunately, called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta, where he focuses on the non-Shankara schools of Vedanta in going into detail in their doctrines and their relevance to our spiritual life and the connections with our tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. So I'd encourage you to read that book. And I wanted to read you a passage from one of Swami Vivekananda's lectures in this regard. He says, Vivekananda himself says, "Unfortunately, there is the mistaken notion in modern India that the word Vedanta has reference only to the Advaita system. But you must always remember that in modern India, the three prasthanas are considered equally important in the study of all the systems of religion." Prasthana means foundation or pillar. And he's about to explain the three pillars of Vedanta. The Upanishads, the Vyasa Sutras, otherwise known as Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita, therefore, he continues, have been taken up by every sect in India that wants to claim authority for orthodoxy, whether dualist or Vishishtadvaitist or Advaitist. The authorities of each of these are the three prasthanas, the three scriptures. We find that a Shankaracharya or a Ramanuja or a Madhvacharya or a Vallabhacharya or a Chaitanya, anyone who wanted to propound a new sect, had to take up these three systems and write only a new commentary on them. The systems, he means the scriptures. Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra. Then he says, therefore it would be wrong to confine the word Vedanta only to one system which has arisen out of the Upanishads. All these are covered by the word Vedanta. The Vishishtadvaitist has as much right to be called a Vedantist as the Advaitist. So this is very important to keep in mind, especially as followers of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. So let's begin to delve into some of the nuances of Vedanta in the brief time we have. First of all, I would want to disambiguate three different meanings of the term Vedanta. Disambiguation, this is something that should be familiar to most of you now, because in Wikipedia, if you type in Michael Jackson, for instance, it'll say disambiguation. There are like 5 different Michael Jacksons. There's a pop star, there's, I think, a basketball player, there's a pop, there are multiple people. In the same way, we should distinguish 3 different meanings of the term Vedanta. Its primary meaning is the Upanishads themselves. That's very important to keep in mind. Vedanta etymologically means the end of the Vedas. Anta means end, Veda means the Vedas. And here, end is taken in a kind of metaphorical sense to mean the culmination of the Vedas, the highest spiritual teachings found in the Vedas. So Vedanta means first and foremost the Upanishads. First thing to keep in mind. But there are 2 other meanings of the term Vedanta. Second meaning, the Prasthana Traya. This is what Swami Vivekananda was referring to. Prasthana Traya means 3. Prasthana means pillars. So the 3 scriptural pillars of Vedanta, if you want to just broaden the term beyond Upanishads, it's Upanishads plus Bhagavad Gita plus Brahma Sutra. And then there's a third meaning of the term Vedanta, and this is why it leads to a lot of confusion. A lot of people talk about Vedanta, but they don't clarify whether they're talking about the number 1 meaning as just Upanishads, number 2, all 3 scriptures, or number 3, which is what? Any one of the many philosophical schools which accept the authority of the Vedāntic scriptures. And there are many of them. There's Advaita Vedanta, there's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, there's Dvaita Vedanta. There are many different sub-schools of Bheda Vedanta. So whenever we talk about Vedanta, we should first of all specify what do we mean by Vedanta. That's very important. So in today's talk, I want to discuss 4 main questions. First one, I'm going to go into some detail, especially in focusing on this third meaning of Vedanta, the different philosophical schools of Vedanta. So what do these Vedantic schools share? What do they have in common? That's the first thing I want to explore. Second, what are the main differences in their doctrines? Third, how are these differences at the level of doctrine reflected at the level of spiritual practice? What can we learn from these different philosophical schools as sadhakas and as sadhikas, as spiritual aspirants? And fourth and finally, where do Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda fit in? Where does the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta tradition fit in? Where do they stand in relation to these traditional schools of Vedanta? So these are all big questions. I'm going to do my best to answer most of these questions in a preliminary way. First of all, what are the major schools of Vedanta? First, Advaita Vedanta, as most of you know. The first known text that's still available to us in the Advaita Vedanta tradition is Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika. His disciple's disciple is considered to be Shankaracharya, and he wrote these great commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. So that's the first and by far the most well-known school of Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. But there are many others. So let me talk about those. Second, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, otherwise known as Sri Vaishnava, the Sri Vaishnava school of Vedanta. This was founded by Ramanuja, a great bhakti philosopher and theologian. Third school is it's commonly known as Dvaita Vedanta, which means a school of dualism. I think followers of Madhva, who is the founder of the school, they generally don't appreciate that label. So it's better that we not call them something they don't like to be called. So often they're just referred to as Madhva Vedanta, because Madhva means, if you just elongate the A, it means followers of Madhva's school. Madhva Vedanta, third. Fourth, Bheda Vedanta. What does Bheda mean? Etymologically, Bheda means difference, Abheda means non-difference. So it's a school that teaches difference and non-difference simultaneously. But there are many different sub-schools of Bheda Vedanta. First sub-school is called Aupadika Bheda. This is founded by Bhaskara, who is considered a contemporary of Shankara. This is going back to the 8th century in India. Second sub-school of Bheda Vedanta, Swabhavika Bheda, founded by Nimbarka. Third sub-school of Bheda Vedanta is called Achinta Bheda, otherwise known as Gaudiya Vaishnavism or Chaitanya Vaishnavism, because it was founded by the great Avatara Sri Chaitanya, who encouraged us to take Krishna's name to attain the highest goal of life. And the fourth sub-school of Bheda, not to overwhelm you, is Shuddhadvaita, otherwise known as Pushti Marga. This was founded by Vallabha. That's just to kind of map out the terrain here. So Vedanta is a vast tradition. Another thing to keep in mind is these are all kind of traditional schools which were founded many centuries ago. But I wanted to make one more point. We should not make the mistake of thinking that Vedanta is a static tradition, that once and for all the different schools are set and that no innovations are possible, that we can't say anything new within the Vedantic tradition. No, I don't think that's true. Vedanta continues to evolve. And with every new leader of Vedanta, every new acharya in Vedanta, they're naturally going to innovate, develop new ideas, disagree with their predecessors in multiple ways. I think that's just natural. So we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that what Vedanta means is set for eternity. To give you some examples, some of you might be familiar with a monastic order called Swami Narayan, which is based on the teachings of this great saint Swami Narayan. And they're a very bhakti-oriented tradition. They have beautiful temples throughout the world, but especially in Delhi, I went to one called Akshardham, which is really stunning. It's like a spiritual Disneyland, so I strongly recommend that you go there. And so they're a bhakti tradition. They're similar to Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, but they have their own unique sort of features. And so a very scholarly monk in their order produced a Prasthanatraya Bhashya, which means a monk wrote full-length Sanskrit commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. So they say we're a new Vedanta tradition. ISKCON is based on Achinta Bheda Vedanta of Chaitanya, but they've also developed it in some new ways. And I want to argue that the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta tradition also has some innovative features that distinguish it from the traditional schools. So you can't just say that Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta is just Shankara's Advaita or just any of these schools. The beauty of it is that it harmonizes the different schools of Vedanta, and I want to explain that in some detail. But one step at a time. So as I promised, the first thing I want to discuss is, before we go into the sometimes somewhat technical differences between the different schools of Vedanta, I wanted to emphasize the 5 fundamental commonalities. What do all of these schools of Vedanta, in spite of all the sort of fighting and name-calling over the centuries, they can be really nasty toward each other, actually. They're good at calling each other's clever names in Sanskrit. In spite of all that, what do all these schools of Vedanta share? Let's start with that, and then we can start getting into the fun. Okay, first, all of these schools of Vedanta believe in the authority of the Prasthanatraya. They accept the authority of the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. They say these are our foundational scriptures. Of course, everything depends on how you interpret those scriptures, and so they end up interpreting the same scriptures in wildly different ways. That's a separate issue. And that I would take a different lecture to talk about that. Second commonality. All of these schools claim that we suffer and we remain trapped in this cycle of transmigration, of rebirth, because we are ignorant of the ultimate reality, Brahman, and we will remain ignorant of our true nature, our true spiritual nature. They all agree on that. Now, exactly what is Brahman and exactly what are we, separately from the body-mind complex, that again, once you really get into the nitty-gritty, there are differences. But they all believe that we suffer because we don't know God and because we don't know ourselves, what we really are, what we truly are. Third commonality. Each of these schools of Vedanta holds that we are not this body-mind complex. All of these schools hold that the body is insentient. That's pretty obvious. Even modern scientists believe that. But according to Indian schools, the mind is also insentient, which is really startling to many Westerners. But every school of Vedanta agrees the mind is completely insentient. It's just a subtle form of matter. So what we really are is an eternal soul. Every school of Vedanta accepts that. Again, what is the exact nature of that eternal soul? Again, you get into some differences. But we'll get to that soon. Fourth commonality. We can attain knowledge of Brahman and attain knowledge of our true nature through particular spiritual practices. Which spiritual practices? Again, you get into differences. We'll get to that later. But they all believe that through spiritual practice, you can attain knowledge of the highest reality and our true nature. And fifth, and finally, and there might be other commonalities, but these are 5 of the main ones. 5, knowledge of Brahman leads to the highest good. Christian traditions call it, or Abrahamic traditions call it salvation. We tend not to use that word, but in any case, it's the summum bonum. All good resides in realizing our true nature and realizing God. So keep these commonalities in mind, because we're now going to get into the thick of things and all these differences, and your head might start spinning. But okay, now I want to focus on 6 main questions. And I want to briefly explain how different schools of Vedanta answer these questions. First big question, and there's 6, right? So the first question, what is the nature of Brahman? One school of Vedanta, namely Advaita Vedanta, so Gaudapada and Shankara school and their followers, they hold that Brahman is ultimately devoid of all attributes. The Sanskrit term is nirguna or nirvishesha, completely devoid of attributes, and it's non-dual. It's only one. And therefore, that the personal God, Ishvara, the God who creates this world, who responds to our prayers, who is all loving, omniscient, omnipotent, that is only real from the standpoint of ignorance, so long as we have not realized non-dual pure consciousness. But the moment we realize the highest truth, we realize that this personal God is also just as unreal as this world of names and forms, just as unreal as our own individual souls. Even as individual souls, we're not real. I'll get to that later. But I focus now on what is the nature of Brahman. According to Advaita Vedanta, Brahman is only nirguna from the highest standpoint. It is strictly without attributes and non-dual. Where does he say this? Shankara says this, for instance, in his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14. It's one of his most direct and explicit statements on this issue. So let me read it to you. It's a little bit technical, but I hope you get the gist. Thus, Ishvara's, and Ishvara here means the personal God, Ishvara's rulership, omniscience, and omnipotence are dependent on the limiting adjuncts. This is a translation of the Sanskrit word upadhis, conjured up by ignorance. But from the ultimate standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc., cannot be used with regard to the Atman shining in its own nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. So there's a lot of technical language here, limiting adjuncts especially, upadhis. What's the basic idea? Shankara says the only reality is non-dual Brahman. But out of ignorance, we superimpose all sorts of false attributes onto this Brahman, like that it's a personal God. Like we also are Brahman actually in our true nature, but I superimpose on myself Medhanandatva, you superimpose on yourself Abhayatva, and so on and so forth. But when we attain the highest knowledge of Brahman, all these upadhis vanish. And what's left? Brahman, non-dual Brahman, right? This is Shankara's position. Now, I've often come across a common objection. Whenever I say that Shankara denied the reality of the personal God from the highest standpoint, they say, what about Bhaja Govindam? I don't know how many of you are familiar with a bhakti hymn attributed to Shankara often. They say, well, Shankara was a great bhakta himself. So what's my response? Let me just briefly talk about this. So first of all, most likely, most scholars believe that Shankara probably did not compose Bhaja Govindam, just based on kind of the way it was written and other evidence like that. So he probably didn't write it, even though it's traditionally attributed to him. Secondly, even if he did compose it, he could very well have written this beautiful bhakti hymn from the standpoint of ignorance. That's the beauty of Advaita Vedanta, is that because bhakti, he gives it a place, but he gives it a place at the level of ignorance. And he says it's very important in order to concentrate and purify the mind. So he could very well have written all of these beautiful bhakti hymns attributed to him from the standpoint, for stupid people basically, for dummies. It's Vedanta for dummies, for Shankara style. Okay, and third, even if we accept that Bhaja Govindam and other hymns, beautiful devotional hymns, were written by Shankara and that he actually accepted the reality of the personal God, we are still stuck with a very difficult challenge, which is he definitely wrote the commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, and there he's saying much less sort of favorable things about Bhakti Yoga and about the personal God. So how do you reconcile his statements in his commentaries on the scriptures with his effusive praise of Bhakti in these hymns, which are traditionally attributed to him? That's another very difficult question. So that's the way I would briefly respond to this objection that Shankara was a great Bhakta. We don't know, because that's a historical question. We can't determine for sure. Even if he was, we have to still reconcile his Bhakti with what he says about Bhakti and the personal God in the commentaries. All right, so that's enough. But how do other schools of Vedanta explain the nature of Brahman? Every other school of Vedanta is theistic. Some of you might know what that word means. It means they believe in a personal God with omni-attributes. Omni-attributes are omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, which is it's a technical term which just means he's perfectly loving, perfectly good. But there are some subtle differences even among these different non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta. Vishishtadvaita of Ramanuja and Madhva's school, Madhva Vedanta, and a number of schools of Bheda Bheda hold that Brahman is only personal. They don't even accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman. So it's the exact opposite of Shankara's school. Shankara says Brahman is ultimately only Nirguna, impersonal. These schools, Vishishtadvaita, Madhva Vedanta, and some other schools of Bheda Bheda, say that Brahman is only Saguna. So you see why there are so many conflicts among the schools, because they're directly at loggerheads on these very fundamental issues. But there's an interesting third position carved out by Shuddhadvaita Vedanta, the school of Vallabha, and Achintya Bheda Bheda Vedanta of Chaitanya and his followers. They hold that the ultimate reality is both Nirguna and Saguna. So those of us who have studied the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, we say, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like Ramakrishna's view. Both Nirguna and Saguna, both impersonal and personal. There are similarities, but there's a caveat, according to these traditional schools, Shuddhadvaita and Achintya Bheda Bheda. Even though they accept both the impersonal Brahman and the personal God, there's a hierarchy, and they say that the personal God is the supreme reality, and Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman meditated on by Shankarites, is just a minor aspect of, usually it's understood as Krishna. By these two schools, they consider the supreme reality to be Krishna, and for instance, Chaitanya school refers to Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, as the Tanubha in Sanskrit, the peripheral brilliance of Krishna. Just a minor aspect. So there's a clear hierarchy here. It's infinitely greater to realize Krishna than to just realize your nature as Brahman. And according to Shuddhadvaita school, Vallabha school, he uses a metaphor. He says that Brahman is just the foot of Brahman. Like it's just a kind of a minor aspect. This is the basic idea. So both of these schools turn the tables on Advaita Vedanta, on Shankara's school, and they say that, oh, you Shankara, you say that Nirguna Brahman is the highest and that Saguna Brahman is only real from the standpoint of ignorance. We accept both, but we put you on a lower footing. Your Brahman is just a very minor aspect. It's nothing compared to our Krishna. All right, so that's the first big question. there are a lot of details I'm not going into, but I want to give you, as I said, I want to map out the different Vedantic positions on some of these key questions. So we already covered the first key question: what is the nature of Brahman? Second key question: is the world real or unreal? Another big question. Advaita Vedanta, once again, is the outlier in relation to all of the other schools of Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta maintains that the world from the ultimate standpoint does not exist. The only reality is non-dual Brahman. Shankara's favorite metaphor to explain the status of this world is, many of you probably know this, the rope and the snake, right? So there's a rope which from a distance, it looks to me like a snake. But then when I come closer, I realize, oh, wait a minute, it was a rope all along. That means there was never a snake, right? It's not that there was a snake for some time and then later it transformed into a rope. There's no transformation here. There was never a snake at any point. It's just through misperception that I mistook the rope for a snake. In the same way, there was never a world. I'm not actually talking to you. None of this exists. It's a heady idea, right? So the only reality is Brahman, but we, out of ignorance, I'm giving these lectures, for dummies like us. All right. But every other school of Vedanta holds that this world is real. And when we get to the next question, we'll go in a little bit more detail about what that means. Third key question: what is the relationship between Brahman, the ultimate reality, and this world? There's a problem. This is why this question is so important. The problem is, if God is perfect and pure and infinite, right? That's usually how we understand Brahman. Well, what about this world? Is this world pure and perfect? No, it's full of all sorts of evils and imperfections. So, a lot depends on how we answer this question. The worry is, if we intimately connect God with this world, then God gets infected with the evils of this world, right? So different schools struggle with this question in different ways. How closely do they want to bind God with the world? Advaita Vedanta comes up as usual with their own unique solution. It's called Vivartavada, which means the doctrine that this world is just an illusory appearance of Brahman, just as the snake is nothing but an illusory appearance of the rope, which is the true reality. So the beauty of this response says, well, there's no problem of God, because first of all, we don't believe in God in the sense of the personal God. And second of all, there is no relation between Brahman and the world. There's no world. If there's no world, you don't have to explain a relationship between something that doesn't exist and what does exist, which is Brahman. So that's one response, Vivartavada, the doctrine that this world is just an illusory appearance, but does not actually exist. But other schools take a different tack. Vishishtadvaita of Ramanuja and Bheda Vedanta subscribe to the doctrine of what's called Parinamavada, which means the doctrine of real transformation. Brahman actually transforms into this world. Not Brahman as a whole. Usually they say that some aspect of Brahman actually transforms into this world. But Brahman in his essence, or her essence, remains untouched. So that's how they kind of grapple with this question, but doesn't Brahman get infected with the badness of this world? Well, no, because in his swarupa, in his essence, he remains unaffected. But in one of his aspects, he can evolve into this world. He can manifest as this world. And then there's this further question. There are two different kinds of causality that these traditional Vedantic schools are interested in. One is called material cause, and the other is efficient cause. These are terms used also by Aristotle way back when, in the Greek tradition. So they often use an example of a potter making pots out of clay. The material cause of a clay pot is the clay itself. And the efficient cause of the clay pot is the potter, the human being who's making the pots. So keep that in mind. So now, according to two schools, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta and Bheda Vedanta, Brahman is both the efficient cause, in Sanskrit it's nimitta karana, and the material cause, the upadana karana, of this world. It's both. According to Vishishtadvaita, for instance, Ramanuja uses a very beautiful metaphor. He says that Brahman stands to this world as the soul stands to the body. The soul is called shariri in Sanskrit. And this world as body is sharira. The world is the body of Brahman. So I think it's a very beautiful idea. According to Bheda, remember what Bheda means etymologically. Bheda means difference. Abheda means non-difference. So what all schools of Bheda claim is that Brahman is both, in one sense, different from this world, and in another sense, non-different from this world. And the school of Shuddha Vedanta upholds a really interesting, and it really smacks of paradox, but they call this doctrine Avikrita Parinamavada. Parinama just means transformation. But it's Avikrita Parinama. Avikrita means unchanged. So somehow Brahman transforms into this world while remaining unchanged. So again, why do they have to come up with these paradoxes? Because they don't want to infect Brahman with the bad qualities that are present in this world. Remember, that's always the kind of the difficulty with claiming that Brahman actually manifests as this world. Now, just Madhva Vedanta, this tradition of Madhva, they take a different tack because they're so worried about this question. If we make Brahman, if we make God, Vishnu, the material cause of this world, that God actually in some aspect becomes this world, then how can God not be infected with the evil qualities present in this world? So what Madhva does, he does something ingenious. He says, so Brahman is just the efficient cause of the world, like the potter makes clay pots, but he's not the material cause at all. So he makes a sharper separation between God and the world to avoid this problem of infecting God with the badness that we find in this world. So according to Madhva's school, there's a fundamental ontological difference, bheda, between Brahman and the world. So Brahman is the efficient cause, but not the material cause of the world. Okay, fourth key question. What is the relationship between Brahman and the individual soul? Each of us. How do we relate to God? Advaita Vedanta claims that the jiva, the individual soul, is absolutely identical to the highest reality. There's no difference. But we appear to be individuals. I appear to be different from you, and we feel different from the entities we see in this world out of ignorance because of different limiting adjuncts. Remember this idea of limiting adjuncts that Shankara uses. Now, there's another school, this is a Bheda school called Aupadika Bheda. I mentioned it earlier. This is a school founded by Bhaskara, a contemporary of Shankara. The term Aupadika just means, it's an adjective referring to upadis. So he also uses this idea of upadis, limiting adjuncts. Okay, and so he also says, it seems to come close to Shankara. He says the individual soul is in essence identical with Brahman, but Bhaskara understands Brahman not as nirguna but as saguna. So this is an important difference. It goes back to the first key question. He says it's the personal God. We are one with the personal God. But because we are not aware of our true nature as the personal God, we suffer and we have to be reborn and again. But so what's the difference then between Bhaskara's view and Shankara's view? The key difference is that according to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, these limiting adjuncts themselves are not real. Those are also illusory at the end of the day. Once we attain knowledge of Brahman, according to Shankara, we'll find that we were never ignorant. There were never any limiting adjuncts. There was never this world. There was never this class. But Bhaskara says, by contrast, that the upadis, these limiting adjuncts, are real. We really were, even though we are the personal God himself actually was stuck in samsara for a certain amount of time because of these limiting adjuncts, because he misunderstood himself to be a limited soul. Okay, so we start getting into some technicalities here. Exactly how does Bhaskara's view on the relationship between Brahman and the soul differ from Shankara's? And all the schools of Bheda, predictably, maintain that Brahman is both different in one respect and non-different in another respect from the individual souls. And they use some metaphors, which even Sri Ramakrishna likes to use sometimes. They say that Brahman relates to the individual souls as fire relates to sparks, for instance. In one sense, sparks are non-different from the fire, right? You can't define a spark as completely separate from fire. In another respect, you can still distinguish the spark from the fire itself, right? Sparks fly from the fire, which means that they're different in some sense. So they use that metaphor. They're also fond of a metaphor of the ocean and the waves of an ocean. In one sense, the waves of an ocean are non-different from the ocean, nothing but water. In another respect, it's different from the ocean. The ocean is this vast expanse. The wave is just a small form of it, right? One manifestation which is temporary. So that's how they explain the relationship between Brahman and jivas. In one sense, different from Brahman, in another sense, non-different. And according to Ramanuja's school of Vishtadvaita, jivas are intimately related to Brahman as his servants. In our true nature, we are actually all children of God. This is a very beautiful idea. And if we knew ourselves, we know ourselves as inherently divine and blissful. So you see, this is language that comes close to Swami Vivekananda's language. But, and this is an important concept of Ramanuja's, he says that due to ignorance of God, our souls are contracted. He uses the term contraction. He says that our full possibilities are not manifest. So through spiritual practice, we gradually manifest our true potential and our true nature as divine and as children of God. Okay, fifth key question. What is the state of salvation? What is the highest state? Mukti. What does it look like? Most Vedantic schools consider salvation to be liberation, mukti. Liberation from what? Liberation from the cycle of rebirth. We have to keep coming back again and again, inhabiting new physical bodies. And after a certain point, it gets tiring, and we get fed up, and we say, enough of this. And mukti means you don't have to come back again. But achintya bheda veda Vedanta, this is the school of Chaitanya. They have a slightly different view. They say that the supreme goal is not mukti, but bhakti, devotion for Krishna, the supreme love of Krishna. But then you might ask, well, what's their stance on mukti? They say it's an incidental byproduct of attaining the highest goal of bhakti. That's just that comes along the way, but it's not the important thing. They call it tucca phala. Something that you don't seek and that's not even important. Once you have love for Krishna, everything else just pales by comparison. Now, I want to focus on two key questions in this regard. One is, according to these different schools of Vedanta, what is the precise nature of salvation? It's the first question. Secondly, is it possible to attain what's called in Sanskrit jivan mukti, which means can you attain liberation while still in this physical body? Different answers to both these questions. First question then, what is the exact nature of salvation? According to two schools of Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta of Shankara and Aupadika Bheda Bheda of Bhaskara, in the liberated state, there's absolutely no trace of individuality left. There's nothing but Brahman. But remember the difference here. Bhaskara holds that Brahman is Saguna, it's the personal God, and according to Shankara, it's Nirguna, non-dual pure conscious. But they both believe that in the liberated state, there's no longer any individual souls separate from Brahman. There's just Brahman. But all the other Vedantic schools hold that even in the state of liberation, a sense of individuality remains. This is really important. So for most theistic schools of Vedanta, most of these bhakti schools, salvation consists in residing eternally in an eternal heaven with the personal God. And they give it different names depending on the name of the God. So Ramanuja, for instance, calls it Vaikuntha Loka. This is the realm of Vishnu, because the highest for Brahman is Vishnu Narayana, according to Ramanuja's school, and even Madhva's school. And so what's the goal? You dwell as an eternal soul, not with physical bodies, not even with minds, but as eternal souls, lovingly worshipping Vishnu, serving Vishnu, meditating on Vishnu, right? And for an eternity. It's not that it's a kind of temporary heaven. This is the ideal for these bhakti schools of Vedanta. But many of you might know Shankara's answer to this. He says, well, in the state of liberation, there's no coming and going. You don't go anywhere, that's silly. And there's no such thing as an eternal heaven. He says that there's what he calls krama mukti, which means the doctrine of gradual liberation. He says, okay, if you do a lot of bhakti in this world, and you do just the right combination of devotional practices and rituals, Vedic rituals, you'll end up in what's called Brahmaloka, which is a kind of heaven, but it's temporary. And after a certain amount of time, it's a long period of time, much longer than 100 years or whatever, but after a certain period of time, you're going to dissolve your individuality in non-dual Brahman. You can't stay in that bhakti heaven. Okay? Second question, is it possible to attain liberation while still in this physical body? And I don't know how many of you are on Facebook, and I don't even know if it's still I'm not on Facebook, thankfully, but when I was a PhD student, I think I had a Facebook account, and I remember under relationship status, there was an option of saying, it's complicated. And so I feel like when you ask Advaita Vedanta this question, do you accept Jivan Mukti? Their answer is, it's complicated. Why is it complicated? Because on the one hand, they say, 100% we accept Jivan Mukti. And then they'll point to the scriptures, the Upanishads again and again say you can attain liberation while still living. The Bhagavad Gita says it, so of course we accept it. But philosophically, it's difficult to justify the possibility of Jivan Mukti from the standpoint of Shankara's philosophy. Why? The reason is because, remember, going back to the earlier key questions about this world especially, and about our own physical bodies. All of our physical bodies, this entire world of names and forms, are products of ignorance. They're not real at the end of the day. So the problem is, if this physical body is a product of ignorance, and if knowledge of Brahman entails the complete eradication of ignorance, then it should mean that we're pulling the rug out from under ourselves, and that the highest state of knowledge of Brahman must entail that we leave the physical body. Because so long as we're in the physical body, there still has to be some trace of ignorance that's responsible for keeping the physical body going. So you might say, well, that's because I'm not a follower of Shankara, and so I'm saying, no, the followers of Shankara say this. Madhusudana Saraswati and many others, they have fierce debates about this. And because they struggle with this question. They know that they need to accept Jivan Mukti on the basis of the scriptures, because the scriptures keep talking about being liberated while still in the physical body. But they have great difficulty in explaining it philosophically. So what they end up doing is saying, yes, we accept Jivan Mukti. It is possible to be liberated while in the physical body. But even the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance. The Sanskrit term is avidya lesha. Even the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance to account for the fact that the physical body continues. But the moment you say that the Jivan Mukta has a trace of ignorance, then it sounds like you're saying the Jivan Mukta is not fully mukta, not fully liberated. And then it becomes verbal sparring. But this is why I say the answer to the question is, does Advaita Vedanta accept the possibility of Jivan Mukti? It's complicated. Now, what about non-Advaitic schools of Vedanta? What are their stances on Jivan Mukti? Ramanuja's school of Vishtadvaita and Nimbarkar's school of Swabhavika Bheda Veda totally reject the possibility of Jivan Mukti. They say it's not possible. Because, remember, for Ramanuja, for instance, the highest goal is residing in an eternal heaven. So we can't get that here, right? So even if you can attain a very high state, even according to Ramanuja, he says that you can attain the state of sthita prajna. This is a term used in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. Very high state of God realization. But you're still stuck in the physical body. And so the highest goal is to leave this physical body once and for all, not have to come back again, and to reside with Vishnu in Vaikuntha Loka. And Madhva also rejects the possibility of Jivan Mukti. He says it's not possible, but you can attain aparoksha jnana. You can attain knowledge of God. You can have God realization while in the body, but that's still not the absolute highest. The highest is residing in this loka, this higher heaven, eternal heaven with Vishnu. Achinta Bheda Veda Vedanta, the school of Chaitanya, they fully accept the possibility of Jivan Mukti, and they say that the Jivan Mukta is one whose activities are performed with body, mind, and speech in servitude to Hari. So anyone who's familiar with the gospel might ring some bells, because Sri Ramakrishna also accepts Jivan Mukti, but he defines Jivan Mukta in a different way. The Jivan Mukta is somebody who feels, I am not the doer, God alone is the doer. Right? Sixth big question is regarding spiritual practice. What is this, according to these different schools of Vedanta, what is the scheme of spiritual practices, and what is the highest spiritual practice? There's always higher and lower with these different traditional schools of Vedanta. So, because the different schools of Vedanta give different answers to the previous 5 questions, they also have different answers to the question of which spiritual practice is the highest. So if you understand Brahman as personal, naturally bhakti is going to take a higher place than other, karma yoga and jnana yoga. And if you take Brahman to be non-dual pure consciousness like Shankara's school, naturally you're going to put the yoga of knowledge, jnana yoga, on a higher footing, right? So this is... But another thing I wanted to mention, this is another thing which I think is not often emphasized. We're very familiar, anybody who studied even a little bit of Swami Vivekananda is familiar with the 4 yogas, Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga, right? One thing that's often overlooked is that these terms mean different things in the hand of different people, in the hands of different schools and different acharyas. So I wanted to give you one example of this. What does Jnana Yoga mean according to 2 schools of Vedanta? First of all, Advaita Vedanta. Shankara understands Jnana Yoga to be the practice of 3 things: Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Most of you are familiar with this. These are terms that are taken from the Brihat Aranyaka Upanishad. You listen from a qualified Advaitic guru to a Mahavakya, a great saying. You are Brahman, or Aham Brahmasmi, I am that Brahman. That's Shravana. Manana, you reflect intellectually on that teaching from all aspects. You remove doubts that might come up in the course of your reflection. And then finally, Nididhyasana. You try to internalize the teachings of Advaita Vedanta until you realize your true nature as Brahman. But this is not what Ramanuja means by Jnana Yoga. He also accepts Jnana Yoga, But he says that Jnana Yoga is a practice of meditating on your own eternal individual soul, which is separate from the body-mind complex, but it's still individual. I have one individual soul, you have another one, you have another one. Okay, so keep in mind that Jnana Yoga does not always mean the same thing, according to different, so things get very complicated. Now, coming back to what is the scheme of spiritual practices? How do the different yogas relate to each other in different schools? I'm not going to go into the details here, but I want to mention Advaita Vedanta. Most of you probably know this. The highest practice is the yoga of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. That's the only direct path to the goal of knowledge of Brahman. But Shankara does not dismiss Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga as completely useless. He says that they're good. They're good in purifying and concentrating the mind to make you eligible to practice the highest practice of Jnana Yoga. It can bring you up to kind of an undergraduate degree, and then finally you have to go on to do your PhD. That's Jnana Yoga. They're preliminary disciplines. This is the way that Shankara puts it. What about Ramanuja? Ramanuja says exactly the opposite. He turns the tables on Shankara and he says that Bhakti Yoga is the highest practice because that alone leads to the highest goal, which is what? Knowledge of the personal God, Vishnu, and love of Vishnu. What about Jnana Yoga? He says that both Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. So Karma Yoga is the path of selfless action. Whatever you do, do it, but you do it with an attitude of worship for God. You do it as a servant of God. And Jnana Yoga, which I just mentioned, is the practice of meditating on your true nature as an individual soul, eternal soul, pure divine soul, separate from the body-mind complex. He says, practice these simultaneously, Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga. Okay? On the one hand, thinking of your true nature as the individual soul. On the other hand, doing selfless service and actions in this world. The combined practice of Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga leads to purity of mind, and ultimately you will attain the state of what he calls Atma Avalokanam, which means you realize, you have a spiritual realization of your true nature as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex, and only then are you eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga. Many of us, especially in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, think that Bhakti is a lower practice. Ramanuja says it's a very, very high practice. And having true love for God is no joke. It requires, the precondition for even starting to develop true bhakti for God is that you first know yourself as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. How many of us can say that we've attained that state? So, one of the great monks in our order who's still living, Swami Bhajananandaji, he was one of my acharyas in training center. He would very strongly emphasize this aspect of Ramanuja. He says that we like to talk big about Shankara and Advaita and that we are that Brahman. He says we're skipping so many intermediate steps. The first priority in spiritual life is what he calls the awakening of Dhi. Dhi, which means literally intelligence, but in the sense of spiritual intelligence. And he identifies this awakening of Dhi with the realization of the Pratyagatman, ourselves as individual souls. Because it's only then that you start having this real longing for spiritual life, longing to realize God. You start developing devotion for God. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? He says exactly the same thing. You'll find in the gospel. He says that the first spiritual realization that a sadhaka has is at the level of the heart chakra. And he says, how does he describe it? He says, Shadok deke, the sadhaka sees the jivatma. He uses the language of jivatma, the individual soul, in the form of a flame. And then the sadhaka says, eki, eki. What is this? What is this? It's like a miracle because it's a stunning epiphany. I'm not this physical body. I'm not even the mind. I'm an individual soul. This is the first spiritual awakening that people have if you're doing your spiritual practices right. Only after that can you go on to the higher realization of God realization, Brahma Jnana. So it's extremely important to realize that to make progress in spiritual life, that if we just jump the gun and we just keep telling ourselves we're Brahman, we're probably not going to make much progress. Take things one step at a time. First, let's try to realize ourselves as individual souls separate from the body-mind complex. Now, finally, I want to cover this before I conclude the lecture. What about Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Vedanta? Where do they stand? Some monks in our order, some devotees, some scholars just simply say that Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Vedanta is basically just Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, dressed up for modern times. Updated a little bit here and there, tweaked in a couple ways for modern times. Some monks hold that, some scholars hold that. I don't, as most of you probably know. So, I take it that the Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda is a harmonizing Vedanta. It's a Vedanta philosophy that's unique in harmonizing the different warring sects, the different warring schools of Vedanta. And I want to explain briefly how Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda harmonize these different schools of Vedanta. The basic idea is that Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda accept the spiritual core of all of these schools without necessarily accepting all of the doctrines of these schools, and definitely without accepting the one-sidedness and the exclusivism, the fanaticism that's sometimes present among followers of these schools. So it all begins with, I think, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on two stages in spiritual experience, which he calls jnana and vijnana. So I want to read that to you. He says, the jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind, one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. The vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, impersonal, is also saguna, personal. Those who realize Brahman in samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and all of its living beings. This is known as vijnana. So how might we characterize his philosophy? I like the term Vijnana Vedanta because it's a Vedanta based on his unique spiritual experience of Vijnana. As a Vijnani, Sri Ramakrishna taught, first of all, what is the nature of ultimate reality of Brahman? He says, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. The Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, and the personal God, Shakti, are inseparable and equally real aspects, the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of the same infinite divine reality. So you see how beautifully he harmonizes the different traditional schools of Vedanta. And unlike the two schools, Achinta Bheda Bheda and Shuddha Dvaita, which hold that the ultimate reality is both Nirguna and Saguna, but have this hierarchy where they say Krishna is the highest and Brahman is a minor aspect of Krishna, Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji say, no, they have equal footing. Non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman, impersonal Brahman, and the personal God are on an equal footing. There's no higher and lower here. So that's the difference even with these other two schools. So I think that's very significant. If you want to ask which traditional school philosophy does Sri Ramakrishna's and Swamiji's philosophy come closest to in relation to the understanding of ultimate reality, I would say Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism. In a couple of weeks, I think I'm going to have a discussion with somebody in Hollywood discussing Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta in relation to Kashmiri Shaivism, so you might be interested in that. That'll be on YouTube. Second, is the world real or unreal? What is the answer of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? I want to just read you a brief passage from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. M, the author of the Gospel, asks Sri Ramakrishna this question, is the world unreal? And Sri Ramakrishna says, why should the universe be unreal? That is how Advaitic Jnana Yogis reason. After realizing God, one sees that it is God himself who has become the universe and all living beings. What is his answer? He says very directly, followers of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, those who practice Jnana Yoga, they're the ones who dismiss this world as unreal. But I'm a Vijnani, and I see that there's nothing but God in this world. God has become everything in this world. So how can I say it's unreal? This world is a real manifestation of God. You might know, incidentally, that Swami Turiyanandaji's last words on his deathbed were Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. Yeah, it's very significant. Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam. So that's very much in the line of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. And oh yeah, Brahman is real. And now, so he says Turiyanandaji says Brahman is real and this world is real. And if you were to ask me to put Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta into a succinct formula, as people like these days on Twitter and all that, I would say Brahma Shakti Satya, Jagat Satya. Brahma Shakti Satya, because it's not just Nirguna Brahman, but Sri Ramakrishna says Brahma Shakti Abheda. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. So the ultimate reality is both personal and impersonal. That's why Brahma Shakti Satyam. And Jagat Satyam, because this world is a real manifestation of Shakti. So that in a nutshell, I think, is Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. And if you ask, how does Sri Ramakrishna understand the relationship between Brahman and us, individual souls? Sri Ramakrishna had a favorite teaching of his, which he would attribute to Hanuman, the wonderful, the monkey god who worshipped Rama. He would say, this is the Sanskrit saying, Deha buddhya dasosmi, jiva buddhya tadamshakaha, atma buddhya tumevaham, iti me nishitamati. And he said, there's one place in the gospel where he says, he finds that there are only the antaranga, his inner circle. And he says, you guys are my very own. So I'm going to tell you, my final realization is that, and then he goes on to quote the Hanuman shloka, which means that he accepts the reality, the truth of all of these different ways of relating to God. What are these three ways? Number one, when we think of ourselves as this physical body, we are servants, we're children of God. When we identify with the Jivatma within ourselves, like I said, Ramanuja teaches in Jnana Yoga, then we say, I am an amsha of you, I'm a portion of you, O Rama, O God. And when we identify with the non-dual Brahman, we say, I am you, and you are me. He affirms the reality and equal validity of all of these different relationships. He would use the example of a flute. He says, this is a 7-hold instrument. Why should I just play like that? Saying, I am that Brahman, I am that Brahman. All that's boring. I want to play ragas and raginis. These are terms taken from Indian classical music, which means beautiful tunes. I want to make beautiful tunes, playing all 7 notes. So these different relationships with God are just different ways of thinking of God, relating with God, worshiping God, loving God. Finally, what is the state of salvation according to Sri Ramakrishna? We saw that Shankara says that there's no coming and going, there's no higher heavens, there's just resting in your true nature as Brahman. The Bhakti schools of Vedanta say, no, that's absolutely wrong. The highest state of salvation is an eternal heaven where you can lovingly worship and serve the personal God in some form, whether it's Vishnu or Krishna. What was Sri Ramakrishna's view? He used to say, bhaktas don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. So he equally accepted the ideals of becoming sugar, which is the Advaitic ideal. You dissolve your individuality in non-dual Brahman. He likened this ideal to a salt doll, which goes to measure the depth of the ocean. The moment it sets foot in the ocean, it dissolves away. This is the Advaitic ideal. He fully accepts it. At the same time, he also fully accepts the Bhakti ideal of salvation. There's a place where Mohima Chakraborty, who was an Advaitic, a staunch Shankarite, who comes to him. He's a householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. And he says, but even bhaktas ultimately have to attain the highest Advaitic realization too, don't they? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, no, that's not the case. There are some bhakti schools which hold Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta, which means eternal Krishna, the eternal personal God. And Nitya Bhakta, the Bhakta himself or herself is also eternal. Chinmoy Shan, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna, the personal God, is divine consciousness, and so is his abode. Dhamma means abode. So that means that Sri Ramakrishna is explicitly accepting an eternal heaven where bhaktas reside. And then it's just up to you. So the way I like to put it is that according to Sri Ramakrishna, salvation is like a many-roomed mansion. Imagine some famous celebrity who has 100 rooms in his or her house. And you can walk into whatever room you want. So the Christian will get his or her Christian heaven. The Muslim will get Jannah. I think that's the term for heaven in Islam. Different Hindu worshippers of different aspects of the personal God will get, so the Vaishnavites will get their Krishna, their heaven with Krishna, and so on and so forth. Advaitins, they don't forget about all that. They'll just rest in their true nature as Brahman. Buddhists will also get their nirvana if they want. So he's. I have another lecture that I gave in Trabuco called the Sri Ramakrishna was a both and avatara. Why not both and? Why not accept everything? So that's the beauty of our tradition, I think. And finally, with regard to spiritual practice, instead of all this talk of higher and lower and bhakti is higher than jnana and karma yoga is always like the poor boy. It's like the stepson, so it's always kind of lower, unfortunately. So Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda put all 4 yogas on an equal footing and said, it's a matter of temperament and preference. Whatever floats your boat, do it and you'll realize God, if you're sincere. So, on that note, let us pray to the holy trio, Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Ma Sharada Devi, that we can really try to put Vedanta into practice and have a deeper understanding of ourselves as individual souls and the true nature of God as the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Questions? Sure you have some? Yeah.
Just wait for the microphone, please.
I got confused from the start when you were defining what Vedanta is. I thought it was based on the Vedas, not the Upanishads.
Upanishads are part of the Vedas. That's the answer.
But there's the 4 rig.
It's part of the Upanishads are part of those 4 Vedas. It's just that so they're considered to be the culminating portion of the Vedas, which means they're not separate texts. They are part of the Vedas, but they're considered to be the parts of the Vedas that have the highest spiritual teachings. That's the idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Please say your name before you ask the question.
Anna.
Yeah.
I have a question about the hierarchy concept. And
Hierarchy. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it seems that the chakras,
The chakras.
that there's a built-in,
Mm. Mm.
hierarchy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I've thought about this myself, actually. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, they do talk about the chakras, the 6 chakras, and then and then finally between the eyebrows, and then the Sahasrara, the 1,000-petal lotus. But it's more complicated than that. I mean, certainly the lower chakras really are low in the sense that it's so that's the mind is, as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when the mind revolves around the 3 lower chakras, you're only thinking about lust and greed and these kinds of things. But in terms of the higher chakras, I think the way that Sri Ramakrishna thought about it is that these are at different levels of consciousness. You can relate to God in different ways. And he didn't teach that they were higher and lower. And in fact, the interesting thing about this chakra philosophy is that it's a tantric idea. And Tantra certainly didn't they believed in Shiva Shakti, that the ultimate reality is both personal and impersonal. So they would be the last people to say that the impersonal absolute is higher than the personal God. Because they're one. It's exactly like Sri Ramakrishna, Brahma Shakti Abhed. And the Tantrics fully accepted that. The Shaktas also are Tantric. And they believe in the Divine Mother as the Supreme. And so it's a very good question. It's complicated. And I actually would like to think more about that. But it's a wonderful question. Thank you. I think somebody back there, yeah. What's your name?
Dave.
Dave. Hi, Dave.
Thank you. Hi. With all this Vedantic complexity and confusion, why should I take Advaita any more seriously than the other types of Vedanta?
You don't have to. Why? Who told you had to?
Well, you represent it.
I don't represent Advaita. I represent Ramakrishna Vivekananda Vedanta,
Okay.
which is Advaita, but a different kind of Advaita from
And by the
Shankara.
way, what's the intersection between Vedanta and Hinduism?
It's a major tradition within Hinduism.
But it's not
Yeah.
the totality.
No, and I think that's another mistake that some of us make and others, to just willy-nilly equate Hinduism with Vedanta. What happens is then you leave out other traditions of Vedanta, of Hinduism, which I think is not really. Sankhya Yoga are great schools of philosophy, which still have adherents. There's a Kapil Math, which I visited several times, in Madhupur, in Jharkhand, in India. And they're living gurus who teach Sankhya and Yoga, there's Nyaya, Vaisheshika, there's Tantra. Tantra is part of Hinduism, and that's non-Vedantic, right? So then you're excluding so much the moment you equate Hinduism with Vedanta. Okay, you and then you, yeah.
Madhukar here.
Yeah.
Swami, Ved or Vid means to know, right?
Sorry?
Ved or Vid means to know.
Yeah, or knowledge,
and
yeah.
knowledge.
Yeah.
So Anta is also end goal. So
Yeah.
doesn't Vedanta also mean, from that perspective, end of the knowledge is realization?
Yeah, I mean, the way, I'm just telling you how, I mean, all the acharyas, in spite of all the fighting between the different schools, they all accept Veda in the term Vedanta really means the scriptures, the Vedic scriptures. And so that's why, and of course, the word Veda, it's linked to knowledge. But still, the primary meaning of Veda in the word Vedanta should be the Vedic scriptures themselves, the Vedic scriptures, Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, and those things. And so Upanishads are the Vedanta in the sense of being the highest spiritual teachings found within the Vedas. Yes.
You mentioned the Shravana
Your name, please,
Manana.
first. What's your name?
Howard.
Thank you, Howard. Yeah.
You mentioned the Shravana Manana and the Nididhyasana. How would you define the Nididhyasana?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, that's also complicated because different Advaitins actually define Nididhyasana in different ways, and some will push more of a kind of yogic understanding of Nididhyasana and say it's deep meditation on your true nature as non-dual Brahman. Panchadashi, for instance, Vedanta Sara, these are texts which understand Nididhyasana in that way, deep meditation on your true nature, ultimately culminating in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is necessary for knowledge of Brahman. But there's a whole other sect of Advaita Vedantins which reject, they say all this talk of spiritual experience, meditation, it's all unnecessary. Knowledge of Brahman, and so for instance, there's a modern day follower of Shankara named Dayananda Saraswati, who he passed away about a decade or two ago. And he was a very staunch opponent to this kind of what he considered to be this samadhi-oriented tradition of Advaita Vedanta. And he said this is going down the wrong path, in fact. Knowledge of Brahman it doesn't require any kind of special spiritual experience. It doesn't even require much meditation. If you have a sufficiently pure mind, just reading the scripture is enough. Tattvamasi, it should just flash in your mind. No need for spiritual experiences. So the answer is complicated, as I said, depending on what sub-school of Advaita Vedanta you're talking about. What about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda? This is another interesting question. If you look at the way that they teach Advaita Vedanta Shankara school, they strongly emphasize spiritual experience, the need for meditation, and the attainment of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And in fact, Sri Ramakrishna more or less equates Nirvikalpa Samadhi with the state of gaining knowledge of Brahman. Why? Because he was taught by Totapuri, who was also, he belonged to that meditational sect of Advaita Vedanta, who strongly believed in the need for meditation and samadhi. And so, again, I mean, you can choose whatever you want, but in terms of, if you want to align yourselves with the Advaita Vedanta of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, that's very oriented toward understanding Nididhyasana as deep meditation culminating in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Thank you. Yes. Oh, let her go first, yeah. What's her name?
Gita.
Hi, Gita. Oh, nice to see you in person, yes, okay.
Swami Vivekananda was in some other realm before Ramakrishna,
Mm-hmm.
and Ramakrishna pulled him
Mm,
and
yeah.
asked him to come down.
Mm.
My understanding is that he was totally realized in the Advaita Vedanta sense at that time.
Mm.
Yet he was able to still come down, so he still had to have
Mm.
some sort of higher karna, higher body.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
Some sort of
Mm.
jivatman that was.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
the suitcase is sitting there waiting for him
Mm.
to identify with that. Again.
Yeah.
Doesn't that make it sound like there is like a remnant of jivatman waiting in case soul wants to go in there again, or
Right.
his brother wants the soul to go in there again?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, but it's very difficult to answer because we're speculating about the nature of Sri Ramakrishna's spiritual experience of his first encounter with Narendra, with Vivekananda. But the way I think about it is that, see, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna, these are great souls. They're in a different category. So these are not ordinary souls who come to earth because of their own karma. What I was talking about when we were talking about the traditional schools of Vedanta and they're explaining different stages of salvation, these are for ordinary people like us who, when we become extraordinary through many lifetimes of spiritual practice and ultimately attain mukti, what does that mukti look like? And I think that for ordinary souls, it would be dwelling in, some kind of higher loka for bhaktas, or you completely merge your individuality in Brahman. I think it's only a chosen few souls, even among the liberated souls, who choose to come back to this earth to help others out of their spiritual ignorance. That's the way I would think about it. Remember, Sri Ramakrishna used to distinguish Ishvara Kotis from Jiva Kotis, ordinary souls from Ishvara Kotis, who are this, and he defined Ishvara Koti in a very kind of rigid way as avatars and avatar ongsho, which means incarnations of God, and those who come as parts of an incarnation, like Vivekananda and others. Yeah, thank you.
I would again.
Go ahead.
Vicharaholic.
Yeah. What? Sorry?
Vicharaholic.
Yeah, please, yes. Vicharaholic.
Ramana Maharshi
Yeah.
said that the best practice is to search for the source of the I thought.
Right, yeah.
And this is to make the jiva self dissolve,
Yes.
so that the true awareness and consciousness can then come forth. Atma.
Correct. Is there a question there?
No, I just.
Okay, thank you. So yes, you accurately described Jnana Yoga, or one form of Jnana Yoga. That's Ramana Maharshi's method that he would recommend. Thank you. Anyone else? Try to ask questions. Yeah. Yeah.
And my question is, did any of our monks suffer from Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer's or Alzheimer's? What does that mean?
That's where you lose your memory in your old age.
Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Presumably, but I don't know. I mean.
And if that does happen to an ordinary bhakta or a devotee who's been with Ramakrishna and a Diksha person, what exactly is the state for that person, especially if nobody in the family is of the lineage?
Okay, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but Sri Ramakrishna had cancer. He had throat cancer at the end of his life. He was an incarnation. He was God himself, right? So let alone us. Do you mean, like, why is it that good sadhakas and worship?
No.
Oh, no, what is the question then?
What happens to a person if he loses his memory? Or spiritually, what is his situation?
I see. Well, he's going to come back again, and so that's just a temporary thing. As a soul, that whatever you do in this life, it gets retained.
So what is their situation at the time of death?
It depends on what spiritual progress they've made in this life.
Okay, so if their memory goes completely, it's still...
That doesn't wipe out whatever sadhana that person has done in this life and in previous lives.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
My name's David. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks, David.
I was wondering if you would mind returning to what you said was the final teaching of Sri Ramakrishna that came from Hanuman.
Right.
I think I didn't catch all of it, but if you wouldn't mind just saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just paraphrase it. He says, I've come to the final realization, and as I said, he was speaking to an intimate group of his closest devotees. He said, I've come to the final realization that that I am the servant, and he is the master. I am a portion of God, and he is the whole, and that I'm one with God. I am identical to God in the Advaitic sense, and that all of these are true. This is, you can find it in the gospel. Sure. There's somebody in the back who has a question. Name first.
Hi, my name is Guru. Could you repeat the Sanskrit original of that?
Deha buddhya dasosmi. So when I identify with the body, dasosmi, I am a servant. I consider myself a servant. This is a Hanuman addressing Rama. Jiva buddhya twadamshakaha. When I identify with the jivatma, the individual soul, then I say, I am your amsha. I am a portion of you. I am a part, you are the whole. Atma buddhya tvamevaham. When I identify with the supreme non-dual Atman, I am you, or you are, and you are me. That is my result. That is my firm opinion. That this is the original Sanskrit.
Tvamevaham.
Tvamevaham. I am you. I am and you. I am no different from you, and you are no different from me. Yeah. Tvamevaham.
Gita.
Gita again. Yeah. Or yeah.
Where did that sloka come from?
That it's often difficult to know what the original source is, and this one I can't tell you. I mean, it may not be known. There are a lot of verses like this which they don't know exactly the original source, but it's very, very widely known in India. Mm-hmm.
One more from Dave.
Yes, please.
Yes, the majestic mountain is Brahman, and the amazing Atman is Brahman. What's the difference between Atman and the mountain?
I have no idea what that means. What do you mean by majestic mountain?
A mountain.
Is that a metaphor?
Just take any object,
so
like a mountain.
okay, and
what's the difference?
Between what and what?
Between Atman and the mountain. Or as this is an example.
I still don't understand. What standpoint are you asking the question from? Do you mean Sri Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, or Shankara, or what exactly?
Well, I'm asking you since you're looking.
Well, no, but again, I just spent an hour explaining the differences between the schools. So every school will answer the question differently, and Shankara will say that there's no mountain, there's only Brahman.
Okay.
That's not what I'd say. I'd say that the majestic mountain is a beautiful manifestation of Shakti.
Well, it's like saying everything's energy. It seems to lose its meaning. And
Well, does it? I mean, they're different chairs here, right? Yeah. But they're all made of the same material. But does it to say that these chairs are made of the same material? Does it mean that chair is not different from that chair and that chair is not different? So in the same way, that's why the Upanishad uses the metaphor of clay and pots, right? Mm-hmm. You can or golden ornaments is another metaphor found in the Chandogya Upanishad. You can fashion bracelets, earrings, necklaces out of the same gold. Aren't they different as different forms? Surely there's a beauty in that, while all being the same material. Yeah. Abhay has a question in the front.
Thank you for that, because I finally remembered how to phrase the question.
Mm.
I think you said there was Madhava who said...
Madhva,
thank you, who differentiated between the clay maker and the clay.
Correct.
To try to keep
Correct,
the
exactly.
stain away from it.
Yeah.
In that case, who made the clay in that philosophy? Because it seems like you want to go back...
Well, the thing about Hinduism is that they don't believe in like a beginning time of creation. Yes. It's cyclical. Creation is cyclical. And so he also accepts that view. And it's just that this universe expands and contracts. This actually resonates with modern physics in some ways. And so right now we're in the state of expansion. Eventually it's going to contract. But the Lord, Vishnu, according to Madhva, rules over the world, rules over the creation. That's certainly there. That's what Ishvara means actually. It's lording, being the Lord of this world. But he's not the material cause of this world. It means it's not... The God itself, this world itself cannot be said to be a manifestation of God in that sense. It's ruled over by God, but is made of a completely different material, different substance from God, who is perfect and infinite and pure. That's
how
the
do they
basic.
define the substance if it's separate from.
It's just this insentient stuff, insentient matter, which is, I mean, almost like Western atheistic scientists might define the world, I think. Except it's ruled over by God, so keep that in mind also.
But it's earlier, but it exists.
It always exists, except either in a seed form, in the contracted state, or in an expanded state. And so God is always ruling over this world, either in expanded or in a contracted state. I think that's the way you would understand it, yeah. Any other questions? I've convinced all of you? No?
Will there be a test?
Yes.
Next time.
Next time, I'll follow it. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Should I sit back down?